This question has been roaming around my head for the longest time. Is MSG actually bad for you? To start answering this question, first we need to understand what MSG is. MSG, or monosodium glutamate, is a flavor enhancer commonly used in East Asian cuisine. It is also used in processed foods. It is a sodium salt of glutamic acid. Better said, it is an amino acid found in natural foods such as tomatoes, mushroom, or cheese. Additionally, apart from being found in our bodies too, it can also be extracted. In 1908, a Japanese professor named Kikunae was able to extract MSG from his seaweed broth and determined that MSG was the cause of the savory taste of this type of broths. Professor Kikunae later filed a patent for MSG, and commercial production started later that year. Today, instead of extracting and crystallizing MSG from broth, it is produced by the fermentation of starch, sugar beet, sugar canes, and more. This fermentation process is similar to the one to produce wine, vinegar, and yogurt. Until now, nothing out of the ordinary. But is it safe for you? According to the FDA, is the US Food and Drug Administration. MSG is generally safe. However, as I said, this is coming from the FDA, entity that hasn't rechecked the safetiness of Red 40 in over a decade. So in my research, I started scouring the internet for a little bit more certainty as to whether MSG is safe or not. And I found that in the 1990s, the FDA asked the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, or FASEB, to look into the safetiness of MSG. The FASEB concluded that MSG is in fact safe. They noted that any ill effects come from massive doses or consuming it on an empty stomach, and that any side effects are usually gone within a couple minutes, maybe up to a couple hours. But what about it being a processed ingredient? Well, yes, you can buy it in the stores, but the glutamate in MSG can also be naturally found in your body. Therefore, our bodies naturally metabolize both outside MSG and internal MSG the same way. Now, to put it in perspective, an average adult consumes around 13 grams of MSG from proteins and just 0.5 to 0.6 grams of MSG from the seasoning itself. As for the sodium, despite it having sodium in the name, it actually has 3 times less sodium in it compared to table salt. In my research, I found this quote: "Bottom line, take the claims around MSG with a grain of salt." But I'm not making this video to simply talk about an ingredient. I'm not sure if you have heard about stigma surrounding the safetiness of MSG. And I believe this is a great representation of the stigma us Westerners have towards Eastern products, or in this case, the cuisine itself. So what is the stigma? As I said, a Japanese professor was the discoverer of how to produce MSG in a mass production scheme. Later, he himself founded the Ajinomoto Corporation and started producing MSG massively. As Japan colonized much of East Asia, MSG followed the sword. Ajinomoto's product became a representation of the Japanese culture and entered the Chinese cuisine through Japan. And then it was through China that it entered the United States and the Western world. Many Americans with and without Chinese heritage started exploring Chinese culture and therefore the cuisine. As a result, by the 1940s, MSG-rich Chinese cuisine was popularized all around the country, and American food manufacturers started adding it to TV dinners, snacks, and even the military started adding MSG to the soldiers' rations. Everyone seemed happy. But then the 1960s came around. The MSG panic started April 1968 when Kwok wrote a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine, or NEJM, outlining his symptoms such as racing heart, headache, and excessive sweating. And he fingered 3 possible culprits: salt, wine, and MSG. A month later, the NEJM printed 10 responses from other doctors. Like Kwok, the doctors reported discomfort after eating Chinese food, either in themselves, friends, or patients. However, they didn't make the distinction between East and Western Chinese cuisine. They just clumped it all together and concluded that the issue was MSG. Some of the symptoms cataloged in these letters were dizziness, back spasms, sweatiness, numb jaw, etc. However, none 2 letters included the same 2 symptoms, and the possible links between these letters was to anyone's guess. One even blamed the physical strain of Westerners when eating Chinese food with chopsticks. After these letters, a couple studies came to be. I'm gonna talk about 2. The first study was peculiar because its author, Herbert Schomburg, probably pronouncing that wrong, but Herbert Schomburg, had written the letter to the NEJM a couple of months ago, advocating and actually absolving MSG because he used it in his daily life when cooking at home. However, months later, in the letter, Herbert also emphasized that he experienced syndrome, the first The first study is peculiar as it came from an author called Herbert Schomburg. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but he had written a letter to the NEJM a couple of months earlier, absolving MSG as he used it at home daily, and saying that any symptoms that could be associated with it usually went away within a couple of minutes. However, Herbert was singing a different tune with MSG now. He conducted an experiment in which he took 3 volunteers that were supposedly blind. I'm saying supposedly because one of the volunteers was Herbert himself, so he wasn't really blind, and he gave the volunteers and he himself MSG. The 3 volunteers declared experiencing symptoms. However, none of the 3 experienced the same symptoms. It's like a placebo effect. When you give someone something and you say that's gonna cause them anxiety, it probably will. Additionally, Herbert continued his studies to prove that MSG was bad for you by going for breakfast, lunch, and dinner to Chinese restaurants and having really spicy and savory food to induce in himself the symptoms. Lo and behold, he got sick. However, when going to these restaurants, he never confirmed whether the foods he was consuming had or not MSG. Another study, a team looked at 9 volunteers that had a history with headaches. They gave them 3 broths, one containing MSG and the rest using salt to mask the difference in flavor. Just two out of the 9 volunteers reported headaches after consuming the broths. Most of the studies from this time contained a lot of flaws, as the sample sizes were very small, they weren't truly blinded, and they didn't have a control sample. In some of the studies, MSG was consumed in an empty stomach, which of course it's highly probable that will cause more symptoms. Let's say you have a bottle of sriracha on an empty stomach, you will not feel good. In conclusion, heavily flawed studies were used by supposedly renowned scientists to perpetrate the stigma not only on MSG but in the Chinese cuisine as a whole. And I think it is a great example of how information manipulation and audience ignorance is abused to perpetrate biases and stigmas towards other cultures that do things different than us. Yeah, it's important to study the safetiness of things to make sure they're actually good for you or that you're having them in the right dose. But again, ignorance and information manipulation has led to a lot of stigmas, and I think this is a great example of it. If you made it to the end of the video, thank you very much. This is a project I decided to start. I've always wanted to make YouTube and I have a lot of questions, so I've decided to create these videos to research and put out in the world maybe a small, hopefully research answer to questions that some of us may have, or maybe it's just me. But yeah, that's it. Thank you.